Hi everyone, Vicky here, hope you're well. So I'm just going to show you how I made this little watercolour card today. So it's the Annabelle Spenceley Be Merry and Bright set, and I'm going to stamp that with my VersaFine, which is waterproof. I did originally intend to heat emboss it. However, as you'll see here, I forgot to use my anti-static tool, and I realised that if I then poured any kind of embossing powder on, it was just going to stick in all other kinds of areas, and it would be impossible to try and actually watercolour between it. So you'll see I'm just using my hoodie to get an extra decent impression. I am going to do about 3 layers. This is watercolour card that I'm stamping onto. So it has got quite a good tooth to it. So it's just to make sure that I've got nice clean lines everywhere. VersaFine is wonderful if you want nice neat images. Please do not fear, I do clean off the stamp thoroughly off screen as well, because I know people always worry about stuff like that. So that's my image all done. So as you'll see here, I've got my water paint brushes ready, and I'm using my Paul Rubin watercolour palette. It's still a little bit dirty from the last time I used it, but never mind. And I have 2 jars of clear water, one for my messy one that'll get all mucky, and one just for clean, nice fresh water. And then I always have some kitchen roll to hand as well. I do not pretend to be any kind of great artist, hence why I am watercolouring in an image rather than actually creating and drawing my own. However, I do love this image. I just feel like this image was calling out to be watercoloured rather than just alcohol marker coloured, just with the way she looks. So I think it's just a burnt ochre colour is the one that I used, or yellow ochre even, for her hair. Really sorry, as I'm recording my voiceover, I don't actually have my list of the colours with me, and I kind of just winged it as I went. Sorry. So it's kind of a little hitty missy, but it was just more to show you obviously the different effect that you can have using watercolours than if you do use your alcohol markers. So I did originally start with an 8 brush size, just to get the colour laid down, but then I've moved on to my 6 just because it's a bit neater. That got a little bit too much water. If you do find that you do get too much water, you can either dab it up with your paper towel, as I just did there, or you will see me quite often use a thirsty brush. So all you do is quickly clean off your brush in the water, then dry it off on your paper towel, so it's a really dry brush. And then if you put it very gently over the top of the colour, as I'm doing here, it'll just soak it back up. It's almost like a sponge really, the brush. It'll just take that water back up, and then it'll lift it up. What I wanted to do was get a relatively flat layer of colour so that I could then go back in later to add a bit more colour where I wanted a bit more depth. So for the green, I'm using several different greens just to try and get a nice Christmassy shade. I originally was going to have her dress very pale, but then thought it was a Christmas image, so let's put a bit more Christmas into it. I think I even also add a tiny drop of blue into this green, just to get the kind of shade that I'm after. I do quite enjoy just mixing my own little colours and making it up as I go along, and then I get really sad when I can't get the colour again. So you've got to make sure you put plenty of water in so that it is possible for you to come back to it again. So for the dress, as I say, I'm just laying down that colour quite quickly, just so that I've got a full layer of that. The only thing I'm trying to do is make sure I A, stay in the lines, and B, don't cover up those little stars that are floating around on a dress. Again, I think there's a couple of instances while I'm doing this where I do have a tiny bit of water overload, but again, I just lift as I go. You'll see the image does get a little bit splotchy. If I was being probably a little bit more careful as I was going, if I'm honest, I could probably have avoided quite a bit of that. It's primarily where the water pools, or where I'm trying to put wet onto bits that have dried a bit faster. However, I actually kind of like it in this image. It's just such a gentle little image, it kind of lends itself to that effect in that it makes it look a little bit older and a bit more worn and not quite such a sparkly image. So I'm just using a 1 to try and do these little stars, because when I tried to do it with the big brush, I realised the big brush was just way too big to get into those teeny tiny little stars, which is why I've dropped down to my smallest, which is a 1. These brushes are actually just off Amazon as well. They're nothing particularly special. I think they're about £8 for 12 brushes. But they're nice brushes. They're working well so far. So, you know, you don't necessarily need to spend a fortune. If you're going to invest in anything, invest in decent paper and a reasonably good watercolour palette. I do strongly recommend this palette. It's really nice. There's a nice variance of colours in it, and there are a lot of pigment in as well, so you get a nice colour to it. So as you can see, I'm now going back over the bits of yellow for her hair that have dried. So I'm just going around the edge of her little floral garland, and down where her wings are and her back, just where I think it would be a little bit darker. I'm just adding a little bit more colour and pigment in there. Again, as I say, it's not perfect. I do not under any circumstances pretend that I'm an amazing artist. But I do kind of like its imperfection. It adds to the image as far as I'm concerned. And then I'm just going to go back in again with the green. So anywhere where it's ruffled, I'm adding a bit more colour. And anywhere that's like the under layers of things, the bits that are at the back and the bits that will be shaded by her hair, I'm just shade those in. Again, there's quite a bit of thirsty brush mopping up goes on with this green. I had a bit of a moment with it, I think. But I do like the way that it looks once it's done. Then next on my little list of options is to do her little garlands. So I'm trying to mix up a red. It's just slightly off the screen. This red, I've noticed, is quite a thick red. I have to add quite a lot of water to it to get a decent wash, otherwise it goes on a little bit more like it's an acrylic paint if I'm not careful. And obviously the whole point of watercolour is it's meant to be translucent so you can see through it. So I'm just mixing a few different reds in there together, and that was me using my cloth to carry extra water over because I didn't want to accidentally drip water all over my image, because I thought that would have been really bad when I was this far through it. Again, it seems to be a bit too full on, so I'm just using my brush to soak it back up again. And you quite often find that once you've soaked it up, you can actually then use what you've just soaked up to do the next little bit. It works out quite well, so you don't waste as much as you'd probably think you would doing it that way. But as I say, watercolour does tend to go a very long way. A little goes a long way with it. But I actually kind of like watching it soak itself back up as well. The more I'm watching this as I'm recording this, I'm actually really quite enjoying watching it soak itself back up. So that's the first layer of the red done. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab my little brush again, because I've realised there's quite a few stars hiding in her hair. So I'm going to quickly do those as well. There's a couple more to do. Yep. Then I decided that I really needed to work out a skin tone. Now, as I say, I'm not great, and I am definitely by no stretch of anyone's imagination a good colourist in terms of mixing colours or anything like that. The colour I ended up with kind of came out as like a weird greeny, yellowy, pinky, browny kind of colour. However, instead of wasting the colour that I just created, I decided to use it to paint the candle. because it was definitely not a skin tone, which is what I was actually aiming for. But I think it actually makes a really nice candle tone, so it worked out quite well. I did at this point decide that in the interest of not completely ruining my image, I was going to cheat. So I decided to use just one of my brush markers just to give me a little bit of her skin tone rather than break it. You've got to be super careful if you do this though, because the pigment ink is good with watercolour, but because of the kind of ink it is, if you haven't heat set it with an embossing powder, it will run ever so slightly like it has down there. So you'll see it's bled ever so slightly, but it's nothing too major as far as I can see. So I decided that was okay, and then I realised I'd left 2 stars. So once I'd done that, I then decided to do the little tray that her candle is on. So I had some purple that I'd already used on a previous project. It was one of the ones that was just lurking around on the image, so I just decided to use that because why not. And then for her fairy wings, I am actually going to use a sparkle pen. So I'm just going to quickly add a little bit more depth to the flowers around her hair. It's very much a Christmassy colours, this red, gold, green. It got a little bit too saturated again, so I was just trying to soak some of it back up. It was a very hitty missy kind of go with that. And then this is my sparkle pen, so I always give it a bit of a shake before I use it. I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, if I'm honest, on this image. I do lift the image up in a second once it's done and try really hard to shake it so that you can see it. You've got to also be careful if you put sparkle pen over watercolour, because it is water based, so it will reliquidize the ink and make it move a little bit. I'm trying to get that in the fluttery light. It is very sparkly even if you can't see it. So I decided to make a card, and this is some lawn fawn paper. I can't remember what the pad is called, unfortunately. So I'm just using my tape runner to put a layer of tape across the whole of this card. This card is 4 by 5 3/4, and it is a top folding 4 by 5 3/4 card. So I'm just laying down a layer of my double-sided sticky tape, and then I'm going to very carefully lay the paper on top so that I waste as little as is humanly possible. Sometimes I find if you cut it down, even if you know the size of your card blank, it's never quite right. I can just trim it off with my scissors, and then I've got that nice strip and that little teeny tiny bit that I can use for something else if needed. The image fits nicely on there with a bit of a border, but it's got just enough space at the bottom for a small sentiment. So I'm just going to use the Christmas blessings from the stamp set. I'm going to be popping that into my Misty, and I'll just use the magnet to keep it in place. And then what I'll do is I'll put the image back where I want it, and then use that to kind of make sure I can get my positioning for my sentiment right. Because obviously if I just eyeballed it, I might not have got it in the right place in line with where I wanted my image. So once I've picked that up with my door, I can move the image out of the way so that it doesn't get ruined while I'm doing my stamping. And I'm actually going to heat emboss it with this Lawn Fawn silver embossing powder. So I'm just going to use my anti-static tool to make sure that the bottom's clear of any extra stuff that'll ruin the powder. And then I'm going to use my clear embossing ink to stamp that down. And again, just gentle presses and do a couple of them rather than do one big massive squishy one, because otherwise you'll just smudge the ink and your impression won't be as neat when you do your embossing. And so I'm going to put down some scrap paper. You can see it's one that I was using to ink blend on earlier. And then I'm going to just pour my embossing powder over where my sentiment is and flick off the excess. And then I'm just going to quickly set that aside while I pour this back into the jar so I don't lose any of it. Embossing powder is precious after all. And then all I'm going to do is take my heat gun, and I'm going to use that on its high setting to melt that embossing powder, and you should be able to see it go soon. I do genuinely just love watching embossing powder melt. It's one of my favourite things, I'm not going to lie. So that's the sentiment nicely embossed, and then I'm going to use some of my 3M Forma Roll tape to put on the back of that, make sure there's plenty on so it's nicely supported. This tape I actually got off Amazon, and the roll is massive and it's actually really nice tape. So I will probably be investing in some more of that at some point. I do really like it. However, I feel like this roll may last me quite a while, so it's not an urgent purchase. But I am definitely going to stock up on it. I'm not the best at removing the back off foam, so I do apologise. Although this stuff I do find it's slightly easier to do it with for some reason that I haven't quite worked out, but I'm not going to knock it because it's amazing I can actually do it. So I'm going to get that image lined up, and that is the card all nicely done. I hope you've enjoyed, and please come back for more. Bye!